Silence is not empty. It holds things. On a hot August afternoon, a couple walked toward a pile of stones everyone called the lime kiln, and they never returned. Years later, when the wall of that kiln was broken open, lime dust rose like an ancient sigh, and two red objects told the rest of the story: a crooked little radio and a frayed handkerchief. What happened between the dirt road and that dark opening is what still weighs on the hearts of those left behind. The Nogueira house seemed built to welcome the sun. It had pale plaster, a peeling green door, a narrow porch, and a bench worn down by time, resting in the perfect shade for a midday nap. The wind came hot off the flagstones, carrying the scent of parched earth and freshly turned soil, and it would gently tap against the clay-tiled roof, which creaked with every change in temperature. This is where Joaquim Nogueira, at 72 years old, spent his afternoons. His thin shoulders were slumped forward, his work boots crossed, and his brown leather hat was tilted at an angle that seemed a part of him. In his lap rested a red, battery-powered radio. He would turn the volume just high enough to hear the announcer read the news from the backlands and, every now and then, play an old song that made him tap his foot in time. Maria de Lourdes, whom everyone called Dona Lourdes, would appear at the door with a cup of coffee brewed through a cloth filter, the sweet smell of guava paste simmering on the wood stove drifting behind her. She wore a blue calico dress with tiny flowers and a floral scarf tied around her head. A plaid bag always hung from her wrist, filled with thread, needles, and scraps of fabric, or a packet of flour on her way back from the market. Her voice was soft, but there was nothing fragile about her. She rose before dawn to milk the cows, stirred pots of sweets to sell at the market, and when she sat down to sew, her fingers knew the way without her eyes needing to guide them. Married for over 4 decades, they were like landmarks on the road, firm, visible, a part of the landscape. Joaquim had been a cattleman in his more vigorous days, with the grit of leather on his arms and chest, spending nights in the corral, listening to the lowing of cattle under a starry sky. He stopped when his back and knee began to complain and tended to his small plot of corn, beans, and cactus pear. Still, his body held the posture of a man who had learned to read the land like a face. He was a man of few words, an honest handshake, and a humor that broke through like sunshine after a storm. She, with her easy laugh, was known as a meticulous candy maker and a seamstress with a light touch. She could alter a wedding dress made of humble cloth and make the bride feel like a queen. Their 2 children had followed different paths, as often happens when opportunities run dry. Raimundo took to the road, a truck driver based in Recife, gone for weeks at a time. His visits were short, a presence that arrived on a set date and left behind the smell of diesel. Ana Paula stayed nearby. She had married young, separated, and was raising her son on the unpaved streets on the outskirts of Serra Talhada. She was the one who showed up every other day, bringing bread, picking up sweets to sell, striking up a conversation that kept pace with life. At the head of the yard, near the wattle and daub fence, stood a circular formation of stones covered in hardened clay. The locals called it the Calleira, an old kiln where, in another time, they had burned limestone to make lime. No one used it anymore. It had become a reference point. Turn after the kiln. The well is just before the kiln. From a distance, it looked like just a mound of bound stones with weeds clinging to the cracks. Joaquim often looked at it from the porch as if it were a piece of history waiting to be reread. He was always saying that the highest part of the land, near the kiln, needed attention. When the rains fail, he'd say, the water runs right through there and carries away the good soil. It was the mark of a man who never stopped caring for the land, even if it was more with his eyes than with his arms. The morning of May 12th, 1998, dawned with a washed-out blue sky. The light was sharp, casting hard shadows. The heat promised to settle in for the long afternoon. Joaquim had his coffee with couscous and scrambled eggs, tucked his beige shirt into his green denim trousers, and checked the radio's batteries, tapping the bottom with his index finger as if the touch could improve the signal. Dona Lourdes left the pot of sweets to cool, covering it with a cotton cloth. While packing her bag with a spool of thread, a small pair of scissors, a bottle of water, and a piece of bread, she mentioned she needed to check the fence near the kiln, where a stubborn goat had been beating a way through. At 2 in the afternoon, the sun seemed to rest on the shoulders of anyone who dared to venture out from the porch. They left anyway because people of the land learned to negotiate with the heat. They passed through the gate, secured it with a piece of wire, and continued down the side road, the dust rising softly under her sandals and his boots. Ana Paula wasn't there. She was supposed to stop by at the end of the day to pick up 2 jars of sweets. A neighbor, Jose Arimatea, saw the couple from his yard. Leaning against his fence, his hand shielding his eyes, he noticed the familiar silhouettes, the leather hat drawing a triangle against the sun, her blue floral dress moving like a wind-rippled pond. He raised an arm, shouted a good afternoon that the wind carried away, and went back to inspecting his cactus, worrying about pests and how the drought conspired against a good harvest. Up close, the lime kiln was taller than it appeared from a distance. The hardened clay was etched with fine cracks. Its low, dark opening resembled the mouth of a bread oven, only abandoned. Around it lay loose stones and the tracks of goats. There the air seemed to stand still, as if the dust itself had thickened time. Joaquim and Dona Lourdes made it that far. This is the one fact the region's memory has held on to. What happened next is a gap in time that took 16 years to reveal. On that afternoon, however, nothing seemed to foretell a loss. All around them, the scrubland displayed its harsh beauty. The spines of a mandakaru cactus gleamed. A chique cactus was streaked with dust. A crimson-fronted cardinal insisted on singing. Dona Lourdes adjusted her scarf, wiped her forehead with its edge, and took a sip of water. Joaquim leaned against the kiln's rough wall as if measuring something he couldn't see. In his silence, there was a list of small tasks. Check on the umbuzero tree, test the firmness of the fence, consider if it was worth clearing the brush there when the first rains came. The rest of the world carried on. A truck rumbled by in the distance, its sound sliced into pieces by the wind. A dog barked at a shadow. No one was watching the clock. The sun went down with a haste that only seems like haste when you realize the afternoon has become too short. In the Nogueira kitchen, the coffee began to cool. A thin film formed over the sweets on the stove, like the skin on milk. On the clothesline, one of Joaquim's shirts swayed gently. It was the kind of day in the backlands that ends with people on a bench outside, listening to the news on the radio and watching the sky fade from blue to lead. But in that house, on that afternoon, the chairs remained empty. And when the first star lit up, low in the sky, no one saw its reflection in the antenna of the little red radio. Ana Paula arrived when the sky had turned from violet to black. She found it strange that the door was only ajar. Dona Lourdes always locked it, even if she was just going nearby. The kitchen was tidy, an enamel mug holding the dregs of cold coffee, the pot of sweets covered. In the bedroom, the bed was made, the smell of soap still strong. "Mama!" she called once, then again, walking through the house. The silence answered with the sounds of the night, a distant frog croaking, the thin wind whistling through the tin of the chicken coop. Nothing was out of place, which only made the emptiness more unsettling. She ran to Jose Arimatea's house, and he confirmed it. He'd seen the couple walking toward the kiln around 2 o'clock. The two of them returned to the Nogueira property with an old flashlight. Its beam was weak, and they walked the road calling their names. Seu Joaquim, Dona Lourdes. The only reply was the sound of shrubs scraping against their own thorns. When they got near the kiln, the air felt colder, not from mystery, but because the wind hit differently there. Ana Paula felt a chill she blamed on the drying sweat on her skin. They walked around the structure, shining the light into the crevices, but saw only stones, dust, and tangled branches. There were no recent human footprints near the mouth of the kiln. They made another round of the property, the faint moonlight barely illuminating the paths. Back at the house, she decided to wait a little longer, convinced her parents might have gone to visit a more distant neighbor. By midnight, the waiting had curdled into the heavy certainty of absence. The next morning, with the sun already burning, the news spread through the farmlands as fast as anything that carries a threat. The search began as it always does. Locals forming groups, each with their water, a hat, a machete, and the stubbornness of those who refuse to lose someone like that in the dry lands. They scoured reservoirs, lowlands, sparse brush, and ravines. They found goat tracks, old tire marks, the bones of an animal. They found a strip of leather that could have been from a sandal, but it was too dark to be sure. A young man said he'd heard a radio playing 4/0 music late in the afternoon, but out there you could hear a radio from miles away. 2 days later, men trained in finding people arrived. They mapped the trails like pieces of a puzzle made of earth. They interviewed neighbors, noted routines, and asked simple questions in a hard, direct tone. Ana Paula recounted her parents' habits, the radio, the bag, the clothes they were wearing. Raimundo arrived from Recife, his face etched with road weariness, his voice tight. He said his father was not one to get lost, that he knew every curve of that land. The word disappeared began to feel too large in everyone's mouth. An old man mentioned the kiln, but the suggestion of going inside was put off. From the outside, the structure looked sealed. The clay caked on, the stones fitted together as if the kiln had become a monolith. The common reasoning was that if anyone had gone in, they would have left clear marks. And so the search moved outward in ever-widening circles like the ripples from a stone thrown into a pond. Late on the third afternoon, as the wind shifted and brought the smell of hot brush, Ana Paula went into the house and sat on the porch bench her father used to occupy. The radio was not there. The absence of that red rectangle screamed out like a cry. She remembered how Joaquim would adjust the volume with his thumb, how he sometimes held the device to his chest as if to quiet his own heart. She looked out at the yard, at the long shadow of the mango tree, the dust clinging to the leaves. She wept a dry cry, the kind of cry the Caatinga knows. The official search lasted a week. After that, it continued on the strength of the community, the efforts growing more sporadic as hope wore thin and turned to a scar. Rumors arrived, as they always do. They spoke of a robbery on the road, of a dispute over water, of an old feud no one quite remembered. Nothing ever solidified into proof. Raimundo insisted they drag the deepest reservoir, the one past the bend in the clay pit. Men went down with ropes, sinking into mud up to their shins. They stirred up murky water that smelled of dead fish and rotting leaves. Nothing. They searched the trail where years before a boy had gotten lost among the thorny trees. Nothing. The land seemed to have swallowed the couple without a sound, like sand closing over a footprint seconds after it's made. On the 8th day, a heavy silence fell over the living room. Ana Paula realized the smell of coffee no longer held people there. Life had to go on. Raimundo had to get back on the road. The search team packed their equipment and left instructions. "If there's any news, call us." The sentence hung in the air, empty of promise. That night she set the table the way her mother used to, a kind of silent prayer. She pressed her ear to the bedroom window and for a moment thought she heard the static of a radio from far away. It was only the wind cutting through the dry leaves. When she closed the door to the house, Anna Paula felt that if she looked back, she would see her father on the bench and her mother adjusting her headscarf. She didn't look back. If you enjoy investigations narrated with care and respect and want to understand how the smallest details can change everything in a case like this, subscribe now so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Here, every clue is treated with the weight it deserves. The dust of the road clung to the skin, a memory that wouldn't yield to the first wash. From that day on, whenever she passed the lime kiln, Anna Paula quickened her pace for no reason she could name. The sun continued to rise, the house remained in waiting, as houses in the backlands do when someone doesn't return. Still standing, but with an emptiness beating within. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into a calendar that Anna Paula scratched on her bedroom wall, stubbornly trying to give shape to the passage of time. When the dust settled, the farmhouse began to fill with specific silences. The empty space of the leather hat on its nail, the lighter patch of wood on the bench where Joaquim used to sit, the dishcloth that Dona Lourdes would fold with two perfect creases. Anna Paula kept everything as it was, an attempt to preserve a map that might one day show the way back. The search continued, though more sporadically now, carried on by neighbors and relatives, each offering what they could: an old jeep, a horse resistant to the heat, a pair of watchful eyes. Some swore they had seen a similar couple hitchhiking on the main road, others claimed to have heard a crackling radio on the stony flats on the night they vanished. But the clues evaporated on contact. The Caatinga is generous in what it hides and sparing in what it reveals. A group of experienced men went up into the hills, some following a dry creek bed, searching crevices between the rocks. They returned at dusk with their fingers raw and scratched, bringing back only one certainty: they were not there. On paper, the investigation found its way to a high shelf. Statements were taken, routes checked, timelines compared. The phrase "insufficient evidence" became a rubber stamp. The lime kiln appeared again in the reports, a landmark. Someone noted that its entrance seemed sealed with hardened mud and firm stays, a sign that no one had passed that way for a long time. The silent decision was made to look forward. The kiln remained an immovable object, the kind the eye learns to look around. Raimundo returned when he could, his visits measured by the clock of his travels. He brought sweet bread from Recife, left tools, replaced the padlock on the gate. One day, sitting on the porch, he noticed the absence of the small radio, as if it were a hole in the table. Instead of words, he let out a heavy sigh that seemed to sink into the clay of the walls. He told Ana Paula he couldn't listen to sertanejo music without picturing his father tapping his foot. She replied that she could no longer pick up her mother's blue calico dress without a tightness in her throat. For both of them, the objects were triggers of presence. There were afternoons when Ana Paula, back from work, would go to the farm just to sweep the yard and splash a bucket of water on the fine dust in front of the house, breathing in the rising scent of wet earth and, for a few seconds, manufacturing the illusion of rain. Other times she would sit with her back to the kiln, refusing to give a name to what she feared. In a conversation with a neighbor, she remarked that sometimes she felt the answer was too close, like something hidden in plain sight on the table. The neighbor, who knew life's deceptions, chose not to comment. The town moved on, as all towns do. At the market, Dona Lourdes' stall remained empty, its vacancy filled with commentary. Everyone knew her sweets were always perfect. The headscarf was recognized at the gas station, where the attendant would ask Raimundo if there was any news. Ana Paula's son grew up and learned to speak of his grandfather as a character from a bedtime story. The man with the leather hat and the little radio. Time has a peculiar way of settling grief. By the end of 1999, the searches had become occasional visits to the police station to ask about distant findings, calls to hospitals when skewed reports of an elderly person without documents surfaced, and promises of mass that warmed the family's faith. The farmhouse, closed during the week, was opened on Saturdays for airing and cleaning. Ana Paula would wipe the floors with water and vinegar, clearing the fine dust that always insisted on returning. She would arrange the plates in the cupboard. Sometimes the key would jam in the lock, and she would laugh nervously as if talking to the walls. The lime kiln became a negative presence, defined by the act of not looking at it. The mound of stones remained discreet and stubborn. Children would venture near to hunt for lizards but were called back with a scolding and the threat of punishment. That is not a place to play. In years of little rain, the structure seemed to melt slightly, trickling white powder at its edges. In better years, the brush grew high, embracing its base, but no one ever tested its mouth. They lacked the courage, the reason, the tools. Perhaps it was all of these things combined with the way life shoves us forward, even when our minds insist on looking back. Birthdays passed, new lives began, goodbyes were said. In 2005, Ana Paula's son started school and drew a picture of his family. 2 adults, a woman in a headscarf, a man in a hat, and in the middle a red radio taller than everyone. The teacher found it amusing and asked why it was so important. He answered simply, "Because it shines." The shine was the memory of others' eyes upon the object, the aura things acquire when the one who held them disappears. One late afternoon in 2010, Ana Paula was caught in a light drizzle, one that barely wet the ground but raised a good smell from the earth. She stopped in the middle of the dirt road, watched the hills turn a deep blue, and listened to the chorus of frogs. For a moment she thought she could begin again. Times like that would come, moments of breath. Then the hot wind would return, bringing a dust that clung to the skin and to the thoughts. She grew accustomed to visiting her parents' absence, like one who visits a grave that does not exist. In 2014, when the drought tightened its grip and a neighbor decided to expand his cactus plantation, word got out that a tractor would be clearing the higher ground. The news reached Ana Paula like all news you don't know you need, without fanfare. She nodded and hoped that disturbing the earth would bring future rains. She never suspected that in the very place where her fear lived, the machine's iron blade would open a fissure. Until then, the Nogueira family's story was a road that ended at a blind curve. It was just waiting for someone to make the turn. On the morning of November 26, 2004, the sound that ruled the farm was not of birds nor of a goat butting its horns against a fence post. It was the steady, mechanical growl of a tractor. Jose Arimatea had hired the service to expand his plantation, and the operator, Paulo Enrique, arrived early, his cap pulled low, his shirt already soaked with sweat. Before 9 o'clock, the bucket bit into the softest part of the land, opening furrows, turning clumps of earth that smelled of warm roots. The sun was already burning when the tractor aimed for the high ground near the lime kiln. A tire slipped. The bucket scraped against a small mound of stones, and then, suddenly, it plunged deeper than it should have. The sound changed from a low rumble to a hollow thud. There was a short crack, and a piece of the wall broke away like the crust of hard bread. The white dust that billowed out looked like smoke without fire. Paulo cut the engine, and the silence returned, thick and heavy, filled with particles dancing in the air. "Man, there's a hole in this thing," he said, astonished, gesturing for Jose to come over. They approached slowly because instinct teaches respect for anything that might collapse. The revealed opening was low, an arch of stone darkened by old soot. Inside there was the darkness of an oven. Jose grabbed a flashlight from the truck bed, stretched out his arm and switched it on. The beam drew a yellowish curve across the dust, and for a second nothing moved. Then the shapes began to appear, the way they do when one's eyes adjust to the gloom. The first outline was of a body sitting leaning against the wall. It was not a recent body, it was a structure of bone, a shirt that had become a shadow of fabric, a pair of green trousers in tatters still holding the shape of legs. The boots, still on the feet, looked like tired guards at a gate. On the ground, a few inches away, a crushed leather hat slept on its side. Resting on the right femur was a corroded red rectangle, its bent antenna pointing to nowhere. The radio. To the left, near the mouth of the kiln, another shape, smaller and slumped to one side. Thin bones, a blue flowered dress in pieces, a headscarf still tracing a triangle over what was once a neck and nape. Beside it, the remains of a checkered bag and a broken plastic sandal, its strap as stiff as a stick. Jose took a step back, the flashlight trembling. The lime dust had a taste on his tongue, a salt that was not salt. His heart was beating in his ears. "It's people," he said in a threat of a voice that sounded more like a plea for permission. Paolo understood without needing an explanation. They did not enter. They did not touch. The sound of the tractor now seemed an offense. They walked to the house to use the phone, the journey back both fast and slow, like all walks that carry heavy news. The technical team did not take long to arrive, just enough time for the sun to drop a handspan in the sky. They came with the caution of those who know a place holds a story. Photos from various angles, markings on the ground, measurements of the hole. The dust continued to hang in the air, sticking to the sweat on their faces. Dr. Claudia Figueiredo, the forensic expert, entered, ducking her head. She wore a mask and thin gloves. Her flashlight traced the details with the delicacy of someone reading. She drew attention to how the entrance had been sealed from the outside with mud and stones, a careful job of closing a path. It did not seem like an accident. Inside, the domed chamber was like an old lime doll, rough and cool despite the Sertao heat. The first notes were simple things, useful as nails. One male skeleton, approximate height of a short, thin man, signs of wear in the joints, remnants of clothing consistent with a light-colored shirt and green denim trousers. Boots preserved, leather hat to the side, one female skeleton, smaller, remnants of a blue floral dress. Headscarf on the cranium, one broken plastic sandal. A tattered checkered cloth bag, between them on the white dust-covered floor. The red battery-powered radio, corroded but identifiable. There were no signs of a recent fire. The soot seemed ancient, from the time when lime was burned. The position of the bodies spoke of waiting, not of a desperate attempt to dig their way out. The inner wall, examined closely, showed no nail marks, no scratches, nothing to indicate a struggle against the stone. Ana Paula was called. She arrived with wet eyes and short breath, like someone who has just climbed a very steep hill. Raimundo was on his way, stuck on a road that seemed longer than ever. Before any bone, she recognized what had sustained her memory. The floral headscarf, the dress, the radio, the hat. She knelt just outside the opening and stayed there, her hands pressed flat against the cold earth as if searching for a temperature. Dr. Claudia spoke carefully, explaining step by step, not promising what she couldn't deliver. It was too soon to speak of a cause of death. It was clear, however, that the entrance had been sealed from the outside, after they were already in there. This detail, more than anything else, became a stone in the chests of those who heard it. The remains were collected without haste. They wrapped the bones as if they were fine gliss identifying each group. separating fragments of fabric and objects. The radio was placed in its own box. The dust still insisted on clinging to the leather hat, which when touched released a sweetish smell, like something ancient kept in a trunk. When lifted, the checkered bag crumbled to dust in his hands, leaving only the thicker handle that resisted. The sandal remained an outline of absence. One foot had been there, the other no one knew. In the end, the lime kiln was empty of people and full of meaning. They sealed the area with tape and a warning not to disturb it, the way one respects a cemetery. When Raimundo arrived, it was already night, and the artificial light cut through the yard like a knife. He touched the brim of his father's hat, now resting inside a transparent bag, and closed his eyes. The gesture seemed to fracture time. "I found them," he said in a tone that no word could hold. It was not joy, not peace, but it carried a kind of hard-won rest, like someone who finally knows where to light the candle. The news tore through the farmlands with the speed of a dry lightning strike. In town, it was spoken of in hushed tones on street corners, at the market counter, in the line at the gas station. The case that had turned to silence now had a face again. The old kiln, which had long pretended to be stone, opened its mouth to speak. In the days that followed, everything organized itself around two movements: the practical and the intimate. The practical involved papers, signatures, authorizations, a schedule of steps that put the case back on the rails. The intimate was the family learning to live with the image that now existed. Ana Paula dreamed of the kiln's inner curve, the flashlight's beam licking the lime dust, and would wake with a dry mouth. While driving, Raimundo would see the little red radio reflected in his rearview mirror. The objects, more than the bones, were the messengers. When the floral scarf was shown to her in an envelope, it brought back the scent of her mother's hands making sweets. The hat returned the cool shade his father used to cast on the veranda at noon. The analysis proceeded, cold as it had to be to avoid getting lost. Through measurements, through the features of the skeletons, through the context of the place and the clothes, what everyone already knew was confirmed. The lime had preserved more than expected. Parts of the fabric, the rigidity of buttons, the hardened soles of the boots, pieces of the sandal. The team observed the kiln's entrance with attention. There was evidence of ceiling work with clay and steels that seemed recent for 1998. Firm, well-made, without holes that would allow easy entry. It was not something that time would have fashioned on its own. Someone with time and intention had closed the kiln's mouth from the outside. This detail shifted the weight of all hypotheses. They reopened the inquiry, calling in those who, at the time, had seen or heard something. Jose Arimatea repeated what he had held on to since '98. He saw Joaquim and Dona Lourdes walking along the road, he with his radio playing softly, she with the checkered bag. He spoke of the good afternoon the wind carried away and of how the rest of the day had proceeded as normal, until the night turned strange. A man who was 18 at the time told of a sound that he now recognized could have been an echo from the kiln's hollow chamber. A shopkeeper remembered Joaquim buying batteries the week before, a common habit. The pieces fit together without completing the picture. The idea of a robbery murder emerged, and with it the question of what might have been taken. The answer was almost nothing. No cattle were missing, no money from the house. There was no sign of a struggle. The radio remained, but it was there. The bag remained, and it was there too. Their clothes and few personal belongings were also present. The hypothesis of a dispute over water or land gained strength in the corner store conversations. Because where rain is scarce, things grow around whatever is wet. But no one could point to a concrete feud, an old threat, a saved letter. The Nogueira's past held more stories of help than of confrontation. On paper, the cause of death was marked as undetermined. Dry lime steals moisture from all it touches. It preserves and dehydrates, creating an environment that is almost a time capsule. With no evident trauma to the bones, no clear mark of violence. There was no easy conclusion. What they had was the context, the sealed entrance, the position of the bodies, the absence of scratch marks from the inside. The scene looked like people who were prevented from leaving, not people who tried and failed. This difference, though subtle, fed the children's pain in a particular way. It wasn't just that they hadn't come back. It seemed someone had decided they never would. The farmhouse was reopened with ceremonial care. On the porch, the bench was washed and the dust yielded a little. Ana Paula hung her mother's blue calico dress on a white hanger and left it in the wardrobe, like one stores water in a clay pot to make it last. Raimundo brought the radio back, a gesture they had debated. Should it stay with the family or be kept as evidence? It was decided that after being documented and officially released, it would occupy a place inside a glass box in the living room, not as a trophy of tragedy but as a landmark of memory. When he touched the red casing with his fingertips, the bent antenna gleamed in the late afternoon light. At the funeral, as simple as their whole lives had been, the entire community appeared, men holding their hats, women in dark dresses, curious children at the edge of the doorway. The priest spoke little, saying only that the backlands know how to wait and that sometimes the truth arrives hard. There was a relief in the air that no one would confess, a kind of peace born ugly because it came with the difficult image that would now live with the family forever. In the cemetery, the packed earth received them side by side. The wind blew a fine dust that stuck to skin and clothes, reminding everyone where the bodies had come from and what they had passed through. Afterward, the town returned to its usual rhythms, but with a new fissure. Any sound of a tractor on high ground made someone remember the kiln. The now empty kiln was fenced off with stakes and wire, not out of old reverence, but out of the need to preserve the place where history had revealed itself. The space became a point of silence. Whenever José Arimatea passed by, he would remove his hat without realizing it. A gesture the hand invents to deal with what the mind cannot comprehend. The nights in Serra Talhada remained hot, with crickets and a warm breeze, but in the midst of it all, there was a different kind of hollowness, as if the earth breathed more deeply on that stretch of land where the kiln stood. Ana Paula and Raimundo sat many times on the porch, facing each other, speaking of what cannot be changed. They recalled their last family lunch, the sound of Dona Lourdes' laughter as she told a story from the market, Joaquim's habit of checking batteries by holding the radio to his ear to hear the static. At a certain point, they began to trace the path of August 12, 1998, as if reconstructing a procession. Leaving the house, the dirt road, the shade of the umbuzero tree, the arrival at the kiln, the question always ended the same. Who closed the door from the outside and why? The answer, if it existed, lived where no one could reach. The reopened case brought new interviews, this time seen through the lens of hindsight. People who in 1998 lacked the courage to speak, thinking it was nothing, now came forward, their memories sharpened by the contrast of the discovery. One man recounted that in the months before the disappearance, there had been a murmur about someone taking water from a spring that supplied 3 properties. No open fight, just a comment planted in the parched ground. Another woman remembered seeing 2 strangers in a cart on market day, asking if there was good stone up on the farm. But the threads of these stories led to no firm conclusion. The accident theory seemed thin, but wasn't dismissed outright because life has its whims. It was imagined that the couple might have entered the kiln to shelter from the strong sun and the entrance had collapsed by chance. The problem was the finish of the seal, stones fitted together and clay too fresh for a simple cave-in. There was also no sign of rocks having fallen chaotically inside. It was a cover made with method, not misfortune. That left a person. Who would have a motive? The question is always too large. Joaquim was not a man of conflict. He didn't own a gun, didn't drink to excess. He paid what he owed and shared what he could. Dona Lourdes was called upon to make sweets for baptisms, to hem wedding dresses, to sew shirts for the dead. Their lives were filled with neighborliness and little trouble. Even so, the Caatinga knows that small tensions can grow under the sun. A path taken over by a neighbor's fence, a watering hole used too much by another's goats, a misunderstood word, but among the townspeople no one pointed a finger. The technicians returned to the kiln on different days, observing how the wind ran there, how the dust settled, how the night's humidity touched the stone. They reconstructed the couple's likely path that afternoon. The design was simple. They left the house, crossed the local road, followed the higher path, stopped under the umbuzero tree to drink water, and arrived at the kiln. Joaquim, curious as ever, must have entered first, illuminating the space with his radio. Its flashlight was broken, but the plastic reflected a little light. Dona Lourdes' practical stayed closer to the entrance. There were no signs of resistance in the bones of their hands. Nothing broken to indicate a direct assault. The sealing from the outside seemed to have been quick and deliberate, as if whoever did it knew what they were doing and wanted to ensure they wouldn't be discovered any time soon. Raimundo began to request copies of everything. He said he needed to have the papers at home to be able to sleep, as if the order of the pages could organize the chaos inside him. Ana Paula visited the empty kiln at various times, day and night, trying to accustom her body to the place where fear had lived for years without showing its face. The silence there was different. There was no echo, only a muffled quality that made the sound of her own footsteps feel heavy. When she touched the cold stone for the first time after the discovery, she felt a clean sadness without anger, a recognition that some questions simply remain. The town fed on versions, and each version had its own shape. Some argued that passing thieves had hidden there with the couple and, to ensure their silence, sealed the entrance. Others believed the key was in the water dispute, an episode never openly acknowledged. A third group spoke of an old, remote revenge for a reason no one could remember. Nothing progressed beyond talk. The investigation measured steps, cross-referenced times, analyzed cart routes, and consulted records of clay and stone purchases from that period, trying to find anyone who had done construction with similar materials. It was like chasing footprints on ground the wind had swept for 16 years. Amid the confusion of hypotheses, a set of small details remained which, when assembled, said more than any grand theory. The radio was resting on a femur as if it had been placed there upon sitting down. It didn't seem to have been dropped in a struggle. Dona Lourdes's position, slumped near the entrance, suggested she might have been looking outward until the very last moment. The absence of nail marks on the walls suggested that if there was desperation, it was silent and brief, perhaps because the air ran out quickly. Dry lime is cruel in that respect. It sucks away what keeps the body going. The idea that they died together within a few hours aligned with how they were found. In all this coming and going, one image fixed itself more strongly in everyone's mind. That of someone, on the outside, carefully closing the passage with clay and stone, leveling the surface, camouflaging the edges so that the kiln would look like just another ancient block. The act required calm, time, and a cold certainty that no one would hear those inside. This faceless figure took shape in the collective imagination, but never gained a name. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of stories without a conclusion. They force us to live with an invisible character. At night, the wind would beat against the dirt road, raising a light dust that entered through the cracks in the houses. On one of those nights, Ana Paula turned on the silent radio, a new and useless habit, just to touch the button and remember the texture worn down by her father. The silence that came back was full of old static, as if the device still held within its plastic the echoes of lost voices. She then closed the windows, took a deep breath of the dry, scrubland air, and understood that the story of the Nogueiras from that day forward would be told between facts and gaps like so many others in the backlands, and that, despite everything, there was the harsh comfort of having a place to lay flowers. In the small police station office, the formica table took on the gravity of an altar. Dr. Claudia opened folders calmly, spreading out photographs printed on matte paper. The two main angles of the kiln, details of the clothing, a close-up of the red radio with its bent antenna. There was no hurry in the way she spoke. She explained that the lime, besides drying what it touches, creates an environment that both preserves and obstructs. It saves fabrics and boot soles but erases soft tissue marks. She said the wear on Joaquim's knee bones was consistent with years of working on his feet, with cattle in the corral, a hoe in the fields, and that Dona Lourdes had fine signs in her fingers of someone who had sewn her entire life. For the children, this was almost like hearing their parents speak in a language made of calcium. Raimundo rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the photograph of the hat, fallen on its side. My father wouldn't leave his head uncovered for no reason, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Ana Paula gazed at the scarf, which, for the first time since the discovery, did not seem like an isolated object, but part of a whole body that had once breathed near her. The expert spoke of how the two were positioned inside, he leaning back, she near the opening. There were no arms raised in defense, no broken bones to denounce a direct assault. What there was a seal from the outside that could not explain itself. We work with the tools we have, she said. Context, position, objects. It's not always enough to say, this is what happened. Often we can only say, this is not what happened. The heavy silence that followed was not one of frustration. It was the silence of those who understand that the justice of the backlands is sometimes a portrait with a missing piece. On the way home, the sky was streaked with copper-colored bands. They stopped the car near the local road and walked to the spot where Jose Arimatea swore he had seen them that afternoon in '98. The ground was the same and different. The color of the earth was the same, but the contours of the brush were different. Without thinking, Ana Paula repeated her mother's gesture of adjusting a scarf at the nape of her neck. Raimundo, perhaps by instinct, rested a hand on his waist in the exact spot where his father used to buckle his belt. A hot wind blew, kicking up a fine dust that clung to their skin like a tangible memory. Their absence felt like a person, the kind who passes with their head down and doesn't say good morning. Paulo Enrique, the tractor driver, showed up at Ana Paula's house days later with a bag of bread in the eyes of a man who hadn't slept. He asked for permission to enter and sat on the edge of the veranda bench. He told her that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cloud of lime rising and the shapes slowly appearing. He said he felt guilty for being the one whose machine broke the seal. Then he corrected himself. Not guilt, he said, but astonishment. If it weren't for the machine, everything would have stayed closed and I'd have spent my whole life passing by there, never knowing people were inside. Ana Paula held her cup with both hands and replied that certain truths, when they arrive, don't apologize for the noise they make. She thanked him for stopping the engine and waiting. The man wept quietly with the kind of tears the Caatinga knows well, without scandal, just water that is scarce and burns when it finally comes. Their return to the homestead settled into a new routine. They would open the house to let the air circulate, sweep dry leaves from the yard, and wipe the benches with a damp cloth. The smell of vinegar and wet dust created an atmosphere of tidying that was also a kind of prayer. One afternoon, in the bottom of a drawer, Ana Paula found a forgotten spool of mustard-colored thread. She stared at it for minutes as if looking through a window. She pictured her mother measuring a hem with her fingers, blowing on the tip of the needle. Raimundo oiled the hinges of the back door so that from then on, its creak would be a memory, not an alarm. These small acts, anonymous and stubborn, began to stitch a new fabric over the old wound. The investigation moved through the surrounding area with a map made of words. They went to the market, noting who remembered any outsiders. They revisited the purchase records for construction clay from 1998. Not to find the clay from the kiln, which was old, but to understand who, back then, was frequently putting up walls. They heard from a master builder that from time to time, someone would ask for an off-the-books job at a remote farmstead to build a wall, fix a corral, or seal an old kiln entrance to keep animals out. He didn't name names, but the investigator wrote it all down anyway, because in the end, truth can live in a single stray word. At night, in her house on the edge of town, Ana Paula began to write in a hardcover notebook, dividing the page into two invisible columns: facts and memories. Under facts, she noted times, reports, temperatures, details of the objects. Under memories, she placed the small scenes her mind insisted on replaying. Her father tapping his foot to the rhythm of an accordion, her mother testing syrup on the back of a spoon, the hiss of the little radio when its battery was dying. As the days passed, she noticed that one column pushed against the other like two riverbanks in a flood. It was impossible to speak of one without touching the other. The lime kiln, now empty, continued to be visited with respect. The white powder covered the ground inside like a harsh sertao snow. Jose Arimatea suggested building a small shelter to protect the opening from the summer rains. Not for fear of erasing evidence, as nothing more was expected from there, but out of care for the memory. They built a simple roof with wood and tile. The first time a light rain tapped on it, the sound spread through the vaulted chamber like slow applause. The sound impressed those who were nearby, and someone commented softly that now, finally, the Nogueiras had a safe roof over the last place they had ever been. Inevitably, the conversations returned to the question of who. Names were whispered on street corners and in bars, but none had the force of a complete story. One man was remembered for his habit of drinking and starting fights, another for brawling over water during a drought, a third for having driven his cart near the homestead that week. Each time the investigator heard a name, she checked the person's whereabouts at the time, their ties to the area, any possible connections. But the pieces wouldn't fit. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with pieces from 3 different boxes. And all the while life, stubborn, imposed itself. The market on Saturdays, mass on Sundays, the sun rising in the same place. Sometimes when the afternoon stretched long and the wind began to slice across the dirt road, Ana Paula would sit on the veranda and turn on the radio in the living room. Not the red one, which remained put away, but a common one. She tuned it to the same station her father had loved. When an old country song played, she would look at the empty bench and imagine Joaquim's foot still lightly tapping out the rhythm on the floor. It was a choreography of remembrance. Next to the clay plate, his hat now rested clean, smelling of polished leather. It looked ready for the sun, and it was precisely the fact that it would never feel the sun again that ached in a small, persistent way like a stone in a shoe. The reconstruction of that August 12th began on a clear morning, when the sky looked like glass. Dr. Claudia arranged to walk with the siblings along the likely path their parents had taken. It was informal, done more to feel the logic of the land than to stage a drama. They left the house, locked the door as Joaquim would have, past the cistern and the wattle and daub fence. They crossed the road that led to the cornfield and entered the higher trail. At that hour, the shade of the umbuzero tree was still generous. They stopped there, drank some water, and imagined the simple dialogue that must have been exchanged. Her warning him about the loose fence, him replying that they would fix it in the afternoon. The kiln came into view shortly after, with weeds clinging to its stones just as things appear when you pretend not to be looking. As they drew closer, the air changed as it always did there. The investigator asked for silence and closed her eyes for a few seconds. The time it takes to draw one breath, maybe two. She explained that any sound inside the dome would be amplified, that a radio playing even softly could sound much larger, as if coming from a louder source. The young man who, in 1998, had claimed to hear a distant Thoreau song might have just heard the hollow of the kiln turning the accordion into a lament. She brushed the hair from her neck and, with a tape measure, drew the height of the entrance in the air. It was low enough to require one to stoop. "Joaquim must have gone in first," Ana Paula said, not realizing she was narrating a film that had been playing in her head for years. They returned to the city to speak with people who might add nuance. An old acquaintance of Joaquim's, a man named Severino, recounted that years ago, when building with lime was still common, he had seen men sealing the mouth of a kiln to prevent accidents. He said the job required thick clay and the patience to fit stone by stone. His story didn't point to anyone, but it reinforced the idea of a deliberate method. Another voice, from a lady who used to buy sweets from Dona Lourdes, recalled that in August of that year a rumor about stolen goats had circulated among the properties in the region. Rumors are like weeds in a field. They spread easily and uproot things that were never even planted. Still, they wrote it down. Between one interview and the next, Disappearance's life insisted on its own details. Ana Paula's son, now a young man, began going with his uncle to the homestead on Saturdays. He learned to fix hinges, to measure a fence with a steady pace, to distinguish the calls of different birds. The first time he stepped inside the empty kiln, he asked for permission in a low voice, just as his grandmother used to do when entering someone's home. Seeing this, Raimundo felt for the first time that perhaps his parents' story, even without a resolution, would become a lesson. A way of telling the younger ones that the world has holes you cannot see. One late afternoon, Raimundo ran into Naldo, a man who, years ago, had helped Joaquim during the heaviest planting seasons. The conversation by the supermarket gate started with pleasantries before drifting to the topic that pulled everything else toward it. Naldo stated that in 1998, he had been working on a construction site far away and had only heard about the disappearance later. He said it was a terrible thing and that he remembered his old boss as a man of his word. Raimundo listened without interrupting. He wasn't looking for a culprit there. He was just trying to piece together the voices of a time that had fled. Later that night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how many people had entered and left his parents' lives without him ever taking note. The guilt he felt wasn't for having done something wrong. It was the gentle guilt of someone who hadn't been around enough. The technical team had considered one other, less spoken of hypothesis: that someone had used the kiln as a temporary hideout for stolen goods, stumbled upon the couple by chance, and, fearing discovery, sealed the entrance. It was a plausible and ugly scenario, but it left no trace on paper. There were no reports of a major robbery that week, nor of anyone selling suspicious items in the area. The radio, cheap and sentimental, was not an object for trade. All that remained was the image of the act itself, closing the mouth of the kiln calmly, camouflaging it, and walking away without looking back. The burial, conducted with sobriety weeks earlier, continued to radiate its effect. Ana Paula began visiting the cemetery on Wednesdays when it was less crowded, bringing simple flowers and arranging the water-filled bottle where the stems drank. She would speak quietly, recounting the day's events as if writing a letter. She spoke of the smell of rain that hadn't come, of the rising price of beans, of her son who now wore a larger shoe size. On her way out, she always passed through the main square to buy pamonja, a habit inherited from her mother. The repeated ritual brought a kind of persistent peace, the kind that doesn't depend on a happy ending. As 2014 turned into 2015, the town grew accustomed to the idea that the reopened case might simply close again without an answer. Dr. Claudia prepared a clear and honest report describing every step, every test, and the limits of what can be known when so much time has passed. She gave Ana Paula and Raimundo a copy, recommending they keep it with the house deeds. "Sometimes what we have is the journey," she said in farewell, "not the destination." They thanked her with a hug that lasted longer than most, because a little gratitude is also a way of tending to one's own pain. In the last paragraph of her hardcover notebook, Ana Paula wrote a sentence that only she needed to understand. "The kiln no longer looks at me." She meant that after so many visits, the pile of stones had ceased to be a frightened animal and had become part of the yard. It still hurt, of course, but it was a pain with edges. When the wind blew and raised dust on the road, she would breathe deeply and let the scent of dry earth remind her that memory, like lime, both preserves and wounds, and that, in Serra Talhada, life goes on just as it always has. There are firm steps on a ground that sometimes holds stories beneath its soles. Over the months, the recovered objects found their permanent places. The red radio, once released from evidence, was placed in a glass case on a shelf in the homestead's living room, where the afternoon light hits it from the side, making the bent antenna shine like a thin silver line. The leather hat was hung on a hook near the door as always, but now no one takes it down. It is almost a resident. The floral scarf, cleaned with the greatest possible care, sleeps folded inside a silk paper envelope. The plaid bag, reduced to strips, became a memory that exists only when it is told. These small domestic shrines, far from turning the house into a museum, returned it to its center, a place where one both lives and remembers. The family decided to open the homestead one Saturday for anyone who wished to pay their respects. Neighbors came, former catechism students of Dona Lourdes, old friends of Raimundo's, people who had bought sweets at the market for decades. They set up a long table with corn cake, brewed coffee, and bread with butter melting in the heat. Jose Arimatea spoke with emotion without raising his voice, telling of the good afternoons carried away by the wind and how much he missed seeing Joaquim mending the fence. Someone put on a quiet song that played only briefly because no one wanted to turn the morning into a celebration. As the sun began to set, a group walked to the kiln and stood in silence, each with their own thoughts, until a child asked the question they all carried. Who closed the door? There was no answer, just a hand stroking the boy's head and a simple phrase, "We still don't know." That night, Raimundo took a long time to fall asleep. He sat at the table with Dr. Claudia's printed report and read it again, underlining with a pencil the parts that allowed him to breathe a little more steadily. Entrance sealed from the outside, position of bodies consistent with having been seated, absence of injuries consistent with direct assault, cause of death undetermined. He imagined his father resting the radio on his thigh, as if choosing where to place his hand, and his mother positioning herself near the entrance to call for help in case anyone passed by. He also thought of the strange stillness that lime preserves, Not peace, but a frozen interruption. He cried without a sound, as if not to disturb the neighbors sleeping on the other side of the wall. Ana Paula, for her part, began to teach her son how to sew on a button, a gesture that seems banal but is also an inheritance. As she stitched, she told him stories of his grandmother. There was the time she tailored a dress just in time for a wedding, and the day she improvised a curtain from a bedsheet because the sun beat straight into the kitchen. "Sewing is about joining what might unravel," she would say. And the boy would smile to himself, sensing the words meant much more than just cloth. On Saturdays, they would go to the market to buy chintz with tiny flowers for no immediate purpose, but simply to have it in the house. The fabric folded in the wardrobe was a reserve of joy. In the neighborhood, the case still surfaced in conversations at the bakery and in the lottery line. There was always someone new to the story who, with the blunt honesty of an outsider, would ask questions that reopened old wounds. But couldn't anyone hear the screams? Didn't anyone notice they were missing right away? Ana Paula answered these questions with a rehearsed gentleness. She explained that the afternoon wind carries sound in the wrong direction, that people were busy with their own lives that day, that life doesn't draw arrows pointing to where tragedy is about to strike. Gradually, the questions subsided. In the backlands, respect too learns its way back. The lime kiln, now sheltered by a simple roof, became part of a walk Ana Paula took alone on Monday mornings. She would leave early when the sun was still a pale yellow, and follow the path, listening to her own footsteps, the rustle of small creatures, the high-pitched hum of insects. She would stop before the entrance and breathe deeply, letting the dry scent of lime enter and leave her without resistance. She thought of the objects as beacons. The little radio spoke of a man who, at the end of a long day's work, sought out news and songs. The scarf of a woman who found beauty in the everyday and dressed herself in color, even when the town around her turned to dust. The hat of a body that had faced sun, beast, and labor. The shopping bag of a household economy that never lacked for thread, sugar, or flour. Together they told the story of a marriage. One stubborn January day, a persistent rain decided to visit Sarah Talhada. It didn't come with the promise of a full reservoir, but with a desire to wash the rooftops and stir the scent of wet earth. At the farm, the water drummed on the clay tiles and ran down the makeshift gutter in thick drops. Ana Paula rushed inside to close the windows, and as she raised her hand to the frame, she felt the same shiver she'd felt in 1998, only this time, without the panic. She let the rain fall on the porch for a while, just to hear the sound her parents had heard so many meh. The noise seemed to converse with her memory. In the shelter of the kiln, the water fell in a steady rhythm, and anyone nearby would have sworn it sounded like a distant accordion. Perhaps it was just the way Stun responds to the world. Or perhaps it was the entire town, learning to translate noise into remembrance. The inquiry was closed with all the honesty one could expect. There was no evidence to point to a hand, a motive, an exact sequence of events. The final document affirmed what the heart already knew, and what reason had been forced to swallow. They had died there side by side in 1998, and were found 16 years later because chance and a machine had torn open the seal. Ana Paula kept the paper in the same envelope where she kept birth certificates, the deed to the house, and her son's vaccination card. It was a family document. Raimundo, for his part, took a laminated copy to Recife, because a truck driver lives on the road and paper suffers in the rocking of the cab. That night, before sleeping, he turned on a simple radio and let a country song play all the way through. The warm wind blew through the window, scattering the sound across the empty highway. At one point, he tapped his foot on the floor, just as Joaquim used to do on the porch. He smiled to himself, remembering that certain gestures endure. The road went on. In the rearview mirror, lights came and went, and he understood with the kind of clarity that only comes with exhaustion, that the Nogueira's case would never be just about a lime kiln. It was about what we do with absence. We tidy the house, we keep the objects, we visit the place, we tell the story, and above all, we go on. In 2015, when the heat intensified and the wind once again cut across the dirt road like a dull knife, life was already trying to fit into the aftermath. Ana Paula resumed her habit of sweeping the porch at dawn. The sound of the broom scratching the floor was like someone drawing tracks for the days to follow. Raimundo, between trips, would stop at the farm, sit in the crooked shade of the mango tree, and let the silence speak loudly. The kiln, now protected, seemed less menacing. Not because it had grown smaller, but because it was no longer a pure mystery. It was a place with a name and a history. Doctor, Claudia had scheduled one last technical visit, the kind meant to tie up loose ends and to see, with the distance of a few months, if the scene had changed in meaning. They went early, before the sun had climbed past the roofline. The lime dust no longer rose with the same fury it had in November. It had settled, the way certain pains do when they find a place to rest. The forensic expert walked the perimeter, observing the rain stains on the wall, the way the water ran down the improvised cover, the low entrance that looked like a stone mouth. She confirmed in a low voice what the report already stated. The seal had been built with time and care. The interior told no story of a struggle. The objects spoke more than any sentence could. The rest, she said, unafraid of the word, is supposition. After the visit, they drank black coffee from thick glass cups leaning against the kitchen doorframe. Jose Arimatea brought a piece of curd cheese and told them how the neighborhood had changed in the weeks after the discovery, how people looked at each other differently, with more care and less haste. There were fewer arguments over fences, more sharing of well water. The backlands sometimes learn through pain the lessons that the rain does not bring. Ana Paula listened, thinking that if there was no justice that could name the one who closed the mouth of the kiln, there was at least a private reparation. The couple had been found. That doesn't heal, but it puts your feet back on the ground. The little red radio sat on the shelf like a firefly of memory. In the afternoon, the light would strike it, illuminating the scratches that time had carved into the plastic. Raimundo, with the care of someone handling a memory that might break, wiped it with a soft cloth and explained to his sister's son how the batteries worked, why the static grew louder when the signal faded, how the old vacuum tubes held music in such a small body. The boy listened with genuine interest, his hand resting on the glass, and told him that at school the teacher had spoken of the Nogueiras with respect, saying their story taught the importance of searching for what is right and not letting forgetfulness win. At night, when the house was quiet and the breeze entered the window like water filling a well, Ana Paula would sometimes pull a chair to the doorway and sit there listening to the crickets, the distant voices, the sporadic bark of a dog. She remembered the sound of the sweet jam bubbling in the pot, the crackle of firewood in the stove, the hiss of the radio as the announcer changed frequencies. Memory is an old radio. It needs a steady hand to find the station. She was discovering that she didn't have to tune into all of them. Some memories could be allowed to rest. One day, Raimundo, the truck driver, decided to retrace his father's path. Not the one from the afternoon he disappeared, but the path of his life. He passed the corral where Joaquim had worked as a young man, the store where he bought batteries, the market where he exchanged pleasantries, the white chapel where he prayed during festivals. At each stop, someone offered a brief, concrete story. He fixed my fence after the big rain. He was the one who taught my boy how to tie a saddle. His wife saved my cake at the baptism. The filling went wrong and she fixed it. These pieces didn't explain what happened at the kiln. They explained who they were before it. Later, in the sway of his truck's cab, Raimundo understood that his parents' biography could not be hijacked by their final day. Ana Paula organized a small gathering with women from the community to create a memory board for Dona Lourdes. It wasn't an exhibition, it was a conversation. They laid out scraps of chintz, colored threads, metal buttons, and pencil-written recipes on the table. Each woman shared her piece of the story. A tip for getting the jam just right, a solution for a crooked hem, a way to measure cloth without a tape. In the end, they sewed a blue table runner with tiny flowers, just her style, and left it in the farmhouse kitchen. The new object, born from memory, repositioned the pain. Where there had been a void, there now lived a collective care. Of course, there were those who said to leave it all behind. There always are. But the story insisted on standing, because stories like these, when told with respect, are not the weight of a scandal, but a tool for the community. The local school asked for permission to bring students on a guided visit with an explanation about lime kilns, about how the region was built with stone and sweat, about safety in abandoned areas. Ana Paula agreed on one condition. The kiln was not to become a spot for selfies. The visit had a time for speaking softly and for listening to the wind beat against the roof like rain on tin. Early in the second semester, a man with cracked hands, a straw hat, and a mumbled way of speaking appeared in the yard. He said he had worked for a few days in 1998 on a distant property, helping to raise a shed. He commented uncertainly that he remembered someone talking about sealing the mouth of a kiln to keep animals from living in it. He couldn't give a direction, a name, an exact date. The information was too gaseous to be of any use. Dr. Claudia, when notified, went to listen. She took notes, thanked him, and filed it away in the same place we keep memories that don't quite fit, on the high shelf of perhaps. The case didn't move forward, but the feeling that people were still trying to help brought a small measure of comfort. At the end of that year, it rained hard for a whole afternoon. The water, as it hit the roof, formed puddles in the yard that reflected the cloud-stained sky. Ana Paula, alone in the house, reached her hand out and felt the temperature of the water on her skin. The scent of wet earth rose like a gift. She stood for a while, listening, remembering her parents sitting on the porch, she with her scarf neatly tied, he with his hat pulled low, both of them in a comfortable sunce. The rain that day didn't wash the story away, but it did wash the harshness from its edges. It gave a shine to what needed to keep shining. The radio, the scarf, the hat, the bag, symbols of an ordinary life that, by a whim of fate and human cruelty, had become a landmark. Over time, the Nogueira's narrative settled into the body of the town. It no longer appeared with a jolt in barroom conversations, but as an example when someone spoke of looking out for one another. At school, the history teacher asked her students to interview their elders about objects that define a person. They returned with stories of pocket watches, cast iron pans, wooden spoons, and faded photographs. Ana Paula's son brought the radio, not the real one, but a drawing on brown paper with a crooked antenna and the red colored in, with wax crayon. Beneath it, he wrote, "Things that speak when a person is silent." The phrase went around the classroom like wind across a field. Raimundo, on his trucking routes, began to collect landscapes that reminded him of his father. A tautly stretched fence, a hat forgotten on a nail at a roadside stop, a man standing in the thin shade of an umbu tree. He would take pictures with a simple phone and send them to his sister. "Look, here's the old man's way in this curve," he wrote one day, sending an image of a man adjusting a radio on a shop counter. Ana Paula would reply with short audio messages, the sound of the market in the background, and beneath her practical words you could hear a smile. The exchange became a bridge. One Saturday they decided to repaint the farmhouse, not to erase the marks, but so the place wouldn't become a fixed portrait of pain. They chose the same shade of light plaster. They retouched the green door, polished the windows, and repaired a piece of the porch that was sinking. When they finished, the smell of fresh paint mingled with the scent of the hot brushland, and the house seemed to straighten its shoulders. At the end of the day, they ate corn cake with coffee brewed in a cloth filter, the same kind Dona Lourdes had used, which Ana Paula had kept like a relic. Amid their conversation, they spoke of the small joys that fit in any pocket: good shade, fresh water, a radio crackling with news, clean clothes fragrant on the line. The kiln, though empty, continued to command respect. No one set foot inside without reason. The tile roof, over time, grew moss along its edges. Jose Arimatea, ever watchful, replaced 2 slats so the weight of the rain wouldn't bring the shelter down. Sometimes children would ask to see it. The adults would take them, explain in simple words, and say that the place was about memory. The kids, curious, asked sharp questions. One from a 9-year-old girl stuck in Ana Paula's mind. Does everything take a long time to be found? The answer came gently. Some things take a long time. Some things we find quickly, and some things never appear at all. The important thing is to never stop looking for what is right. At the start of a particularly dry summer, an old rumor returned. People saying there was gold under the rocks in the hills, a story that reappears from time to poke at hope. Ana Paula laughed with the respect of someone who has seen much and is surprised by little. She remembered that for her parents, wealth had always been something else. A harvest that doesn't completely fail, a batch of sweets that sells, a pair of boots that lasts. He thought about how the lime kiln, by hiding the couple for so long, had ironically become a coffer of their affections. Inside, preserved by the lime, were the imprints of their way of life. And that is what the tractor returned, something far more profound than any clue to a crime. One afternoon, Raimundo received a visit from a reporter from Recife who wanted to hear the family's story for a piece on old cases solved by chance. The truck driver agreed on the condition that there would be no dramatization. They sat in the simple living room, a fan whirring, the smell of fresh coffee in the air. He told what he knew, speaking of the hard-won relief of finally burying his parents, of the anger that sometimes still flared, and of the acceptance that was built patiently over time. The reporter listened, took notes, and as he was leaving, thanked him, saying that this kind of account taught him more than any headline. The article came out days later, concise and respectful. It helped outsiders understand a little of the harshness and the delicacy of the Sertio. Ana Paula, for her part, decided to assemble a small notebook of Dona Lourdes's recipes to share among relatives. She wrote in a neat, careful hand, pasting in photographs of her mother stirring a pot, of a printed cotton dress drying on the line, of the floral scarf hanging on the mirror. In the preface, she explained that it was not a cookbook, but a family book. The chapter on guava sweet became marked by fingers that had leafed through it with sugar on them, the one on cornbread by smudges of coconut oil. With each copy she gave away, she felt she was returning something. The love her mother had spread throughout the neighborhood was coming back in the form of shared memory. One evening, as the dust settled low on the ground, the boy, now nearly a man, asked to sleep at the homestead, alone to listen to the house. Ana Paula, her heart torn between an old fear and the desire for him to make peace with the place, let him go. He took a hammock, a lantern, and a notebook. He later recounted that the night was full of sounds: roosters crowing early, crickets, dry leaves rustling against each other, the creak of wood cooling in the night air. Not once did he feel afraid. He said that at one point he could almost hear the little radio playing softly, but he laughed and corrected himself. It was just my mind making music out of the wind. That gentle jest, with no trace of mysticism, showed that the house was becoming a home once more, and so, little by little, the case settled into the town's memory like a roadside marker. If you look for it, it's there. If you pass by quickly, you almost miss it. The family continued to care for what mattered. On their anniversary each August, they would place the hat, the scarf, and the radio's box on the veranda. They would light a small candle and stand in silence for a few minutes. The wind would stir the flame, but it would hold. In the distance, the mountains would turn blue, and on the scent of the warm earth, the living memory of two quiet workers would return. A couple who, without making a sound, taught so much about what it means to stay and what it means to leave. The image that remained forever in the region's memory was not of the tape that cordoned off the area, nor of the notes on official letterhead. It was the flashless photograph that Jose Arimatea held in his mind. Two bodies, long turned to bone in silence, still cradling their everyday objects. Joaquim leaning against the curved wall, his work boots still on his feet, his hat fallen to the side as if he had just rested his head. Dona Lourdes slumped near the entrance, her blue cotton dress reduced to threads, the floral scarf marking the place where her voice once lived, saying, "Have another piece." Between them, the red radio, its antenna bent, a stubborn detail that had pierced through 16 years like a plastic lighthouse. When we think of a disappearance, we imagine dark streets, pursuits, loud voices. The Nogueira's story is something else. A vanishing in broad daylight under a bright sun on a dirt road. Searches that scraped the earth and found no trace. An old kiln that from the outside looked like a harmless pile of stones. What came after does not solve, but it completes. The certainty of the place, the confirmation of the objects, the realization that someone, a faceless someone, had calmly and deliberately sealed the entrance from the outside. Among the hypotheses, a robbery, a petty dispute, a silence that was bought, there was never any proof. All that remained was the possible, however incomplete. The family chose not to spend the rest of their days chasing the one question that had no answer. To seek is necessary, but so is to live. And so the homestead was maintained, the house was painted, the recipes copied, the hat hung where it always had been. The radio behind glass ceased to be a wound and became a portrait. When the sun bleeds across the late afternoon sky and lights a fire inside its red plastic, it seems as if the antenna is breathing. The boy grew up. He learned to sew a button with 3 firm stitches, to measure a fence with the tip of his boot, and he learned, above all, to listen. He learned that in the sertão, the wind speaks to those who pay attention, but it does not give away another's secret. If one day someone claims to know exactly what happened, let them point to where they found their certainty. Until then, the story remains as it was found, plausible and open. What can be stated is this. The couple left home together, followed their usual path, arrived at the kiln, went inside, and never came out because the entrance was sealed from the outside. The rest is a fissure that time has not filled, and it is in that fissure that the community has forged a kind of pact. To remember the Nogueiras not as characters in a mystery, but as people. People of work boots, of headscarves, of a small radio, people of silent work, people whose end, however harsh, could not erase the path they had walked. On any given afternoon when the light slants low and the wind cuts across the dirt road carrying the scent of warm earth, Ana Paula sits on the veranda, runs a hand along the edge of the table and thinks that longing, despite its weight, eventually finds its place. Far away, Raimundo presses the radio in his truck cab to his ear during a break and taps out the rhythm with the sole of his boot. In Serra Talada, the lime kiln remains. It is now part of the town's quiet landscape, a reminder that the Sertão is an archive of stories. Not all of them return, but some, when they do, force us to look again at what truly matters. They teach us that in the real stories of our world, where the everyday details reveal the essential, every object has a voice and every silence deserves to be heard.